Some notes from Joshua chapter 9, and that's where we'll be looking at for our first part of class this evening. Really, this sets up the tone and the situation for why the sun stood still in chapter 10. And so what we have in Joshua chapter 9, you have, if you're familiar with the text, you know there is going to be some deception that's going to take place. Now, beginning in Joshua 9, verses 1 through 3, you'll find, beginning in verse 1, and you have there also in your handout, this is, you kind of have the verses highlighted there for you. This kind of goes section by section here, a few verses, sometimes one verse at a time. And so we're going to begin in Joshua 9, beginning in verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass when all the kings who were on the side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland and in all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai," verse 4 says, "they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended." And so you'll find here that what's going on is that, as you have there in your notes as well, it says, "Among the inhabitants west of Jordan, two reactions to Joshua's initial success manifested themselves. Most of the city-states determined to band together to withstand the advance of the Israelites. But the inhabitants of Gibeon, however, acted craftily. They determined that they would try to trick the Israelites into a solemn non-aggression treaty." Now, the Gibeonites were not to be those, they were really originally were not to be those who they would have a treaty with. And the purpose of them deceiving Joshua and the others is they want them to think they have come from a distant land. If they have come from an area within a certain region, then God was not to have, or they were not to have a treaty with them. And so by them trying to fool them and having them appear as if they came from a long distance, then they would be able to have this treaty with them. And so this is what's happening here with Gibeon, the people of Gideon here, verses 1 through 3. Now verses 4 through 6, and we have part of it here. I don't remember if I have all these on here, but verses 4 through 6, you have a section here that says, "The Gibeonite plan was simple. They sent in envoys to Joshua who pretended to be from a distant land. These men were dressed in tattered clothing. They carried worn-out sacks and mended wineskins. Even their bread was dry and crumbled. From their home in the mountains, these envoys traveled the 19 miles to Gilgal, to which Israel had returned after the covenant of renewal ceremony out at Mount Ebal." And so they are trying to make it look as if they're coming from a distant land. And the way they do that, as we have here also on the screen, verses 5 through 13, is that they made their bread moldy. They made their clothes look tattered. Now, if you look, and we're going to look at the text here, Joshua chapter 9. And if you notice here, beginning in verse 5, Joshua 9, beginning in verse 5, and old shoes and clouded upon their feet, and old garments upon them, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua into the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, we be come from a far country. Now therefore make ye a league with us. And the men of Israel said unto the Hivites, Peradventure ye dwell among us, and how shall we make a league with you? And they said unto Joshua, We are thy servants. And Joshua said unto them, Who are ye, and where and from whence come ye? And so they are trying to make it look as if they've come from a distance. They want to make a treaty with Joshua. Those near Joshua were those who they were not to have a treaty with. And so they couldn't look like they only came from 19 miles away. They had to look like they came from a distance. And so, as we'll see here in a moment, they'll talk about how, look, the bread which we took out of our oven hot is now crumbly and moldy. trying to make it look as if they come from a long way away. Now, verse 9 says, "And they said to him, From a very far country thy servants are come because of the name of the Lord thy God, for we have heard the fame of him and all that he did in Egypt." And so they've heard about what God has done. All he did in Egypt is a reference there to the Exodus and how we know what happened there, pulling out the Israelites and the plagues and all those types of things. So they've heard about all that. And they say they have heard of that, and so now they're coming to Joshua to try to make this treaty with them. In verse 10, "And all that he did to the two kings, to the Amorites that were beyond Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, which was at Ashtaroth. Wherefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spake to us, saying, Take victuals with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, We are your servants, therefore now make ye a league with us." And so they're telling Joshua why they have come. They have heard about what God has done, and they have been told by their elders to come and make a league, with them. Verse 12 is what I mentioned before. "This our bread we took hot from our provision out of our houses on the day we came forth to go unto you. But now, behold, it is dry and it is moldy. And these bottles of wine which we filled were new. Behold, they be rent. And these our garments and our shoes are become old by reason of the very long journey." All trying to show that, look, we've come from a long distance. We're not some nearby neighbor, which you're not supposed to have league with. And so they're trying to make this treaty with him. And that's what we have discussed here in this next section, verses 7 through 13. Though the Israelites suspected a ruse, the envoys nonetheless convinced them that they had come from a distant land. They claimed that the fame of Yahweh or of God had caused them to speak out or to seek out Joshua. They had heard of what the Lord had done for his people in Egypt and in Transjordan, that is just that region there. They were too cunning to mention the more recent news of the fall of Jericho and Ai, since news of these victories would not yet have reached a distant land. And you notice they're very smooth and very cunning in what they have done. They really put a lot of thought into this. And like the commentator there points out, they were wise enough not to mention this battle because it should have took longer for them to know about it if they were farther away. And so they didn't say anything about it, though they obviously did know of it. The elders of Gibeon had dispatched these envoys with instructions to seek a peace treaty with Israel. Now, verses 14 and 15, we have here now, the Bible says there, then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. And we have there, highlighted in your notes there, that phrase, they were trusting their senses. They did not take counsel of the Lord. That is, they were trusting, they were trusting their gut, their own ideas about these people. They didn't ask the Lord. We today would probably say, well, they didn't pray about it. They didn't ask, they considered these things for very long. They didn't pray about it. They didn't ask God to help them with this decision. And so they didn't ask counsel of the Lord there in verse 14. So Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them. And we have there in our notes, because they were suspicious, the men of Israel checked their provisions in the knapsacks of the travelers. Everything that seemed to be as the envoys claimed. Therefore the men of Israel took some of their provisions. Here, however, the leaders of Israel were making a tragic mistake. They were trusting their senses, as we mentioned before. They did not ask counsel of Yahweh or of God or of the Lord. Joshua made peace and a covenant with the Gibeonites. The leaders of Israel bound themselves to the covenant with a solemn oath. Now, they made this promise before God, and so it was something which they could not easily break, even though they were no doubt being tricked by them. But as we're going to see, that Joshua, in his wisdom, even though he didn't show a lot of wisdom by not asking counsel from the Lord, is going to take care of that situation, you might say, with the Gibeonites. Again, they were not to have counsel with them, but now they are now in a treaty with them. Now, verses 16 through 18, That shouldn't be there, not break. Verses 16 through 18. You have 3 days after the covenant had been negotiated, the Israelites discovered that these envoys were Hivites who came from a city within the territorial limits which Yahweh had assigned to Israel, which meaning they are found out they've come not from a distant land, they're from within their own territory, those who which they were not to have this covenant with. And so the Israelites immediately marched toward Gibeon to demand an account. No doubt the Gibeonites met them at the border to remind them of the covenant and to point out the terms of the covenant also applied to 3 neighboring villages under Gibeon's jurisdiction. The advanced troops refused to attack because of the oath which the leaders had taken. Though they honored the oath, the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. Now this is in Joshua chapter 9, verses 16 through 18. And I think I had some different divisions up here on the board, but that's okay. We're going to go with what we have before us. Verses 16 through 18, let's go ahead and look at that. Here the Bible says, "And it came to pass at the end of 3 days, after they had made a league with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors, and that they dwelt among them. And the children of Israel journeyed and came into the cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon and Cherbarah, and Beroth and Kirjath-jearim." You gotta love those names. "And the children of Israel smote them not, because the princes of the congregation had sworn unto them by the Lord of Israel, and all the congregation murmured against the princes." And so now what's happening is they originally would have killed them. But because they have fooled Joshua and the Israelites, and they have entered into this treaty, this agreement, they cannot, according to the word of the Lord, they cannot do this because they have made a covenant with them. And so now they're being spared because of this treaty they have made. But let's notice also, we're going to notice some consequences really of what takes place. We're going to notice that even though these men had fooled Joshua and some of the Israelites, and that they had this covenant or this treaty with them, that Joshua is going to handle this in a very unique way. In verse 19 through 21 says, "But all the princes said to all the congregation, We have sworn unto them by the Lord God of Israel, now therefore we may not touch them. This we will do to them, we will even let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because the oath which we swear unto them. And the princes said to them, Let them live, but let them be hewers of wood and drawers of water unto all the congregation, as the princes had promised." And so what has taken place is they say, look, we can't kill them because we made an oath with them. And so what happens? They make them basically their servants. We see there they make them choppers of wood, carriers of water. They're going to do everything they ask. Because their lives have been spared, they've tricked Joshua, they tricked the Israelites. They can't kill them, but it doesn't mean they can't punish them and basically do with them as they will. And by making them their servants, they are still punishing these people for their wickedness. We have that in our notes, verses 19 through 21. "The leaders explained to the people that an oath taken in the name of God could not be broken, even if that oath had been negotiated under false pretenses," meaning they were lied to, but they still had a promise that was sworn in the name of God. And so basically they really do all they can to them. And that is, they can't touch them, they can't kill them. You're on a service. Now you think about it, what they're doing, being choppers of wood, carriers of water. They're doing things which is going to be very hard and very vigorous labor. We continue reading there in our notes. "Israel would incur the wrath of God should they slay any of the Hivites. The terms of the covenant, however, did not prohibit other kinds of action against the Hivites. And the plan was subject to the Hivites to rigorous and humiliating servitude." They're going to be their servants and serve them in a very rigorous and no doubt very strenuous way. Now we keep reading there in verses 22 through 25. Again, this is all setting the tone for what's going to happen in chapter 10. Now we look at verses 22 through 25. Before we go any further, when do we bring everybody back in here? About 8:15? Okay. All right. I'm just trying to think how to plan the break. Okay. Now if we look at verse 25. or 22 rather, going through 25. And Joshua called for them, and he spake unto them, saying, Wherefore have ye beguiled us, saying, We are very far from you, when ye dwell among us. Now therefore ye are cursed, and there shall none of you be freed from being bound men, hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. And they answered Joshua and said, Because it was certainly told thy servants how that the Lord thy God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Therefore we were sore afraid of our lives because of you, and have done this thing. And so they're telling Joshua why they did this, saying, Look, we know what was promised to Moses. We know the command, so because of that we were afraid. And so we tried to deceive because they're trying to stay alive. In verse 25, And now behold, we are in thine hand, as it seemeth good and right unto thee, do unto us. Do. And so basically they'd say, look, this is why we've done it, but now whatever seems right to you to do to us, do it. We'll serve you, we'll be those hewers of wood, those wood choppers, the water carriers, because they get to stay alive. They did so in a deceitful way. They deceived Joshua and the Israelites, but their sin and their transgression and their deception did not go unpunished. Verse 26, And so he did unto them, and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, and that they slew them not. And Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for their congregation, and for the altar of the Lord, even unto this day, in the place which he should choose. And so we see that Joshua has made them servants. He has made them, really punishing them for what they have done. We have there in our notes, Joshua summoned the Hivite leaders to report the decision to them. He first reproached the Hivites for their deception. He then announced that these people would be under a perpetual curse as slaves to Israel. The Hivites attempted to explain their actions. They had heard that Yahweh had commanded Moses to give the land of Canaan to Israel and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land. We feared greatly, and the Hivites admitted, they seemed to be very grateful to accept whatever fate short of death that the Israelites might assign them. So Joshua prevented the Hivites from being killed. He made them, however, lowly servants from that day forth. Their twofold task was to serve as hewers of wood and drawers of water from their congregation in non-religious activities. And for the worship center as well, since the Lord had not yet indicated where his sanctuary would be, the text does not name the place where the Gibeonites would serve. There are verses 26 and 27. And so what happens, we find in short that these men fooled Joshua. And the reason was because they feared the Lord, and they feared the Lord's people. We find that there in verses 22 through 25. But their consequences of this was that they were going to be servants for them. And so we look at Joshua 9, we see the power. Where do we see the power of God? We see that God allows these individuals to stay alive. He doesn't kill them. He doesn't, say, okay, in this case, we're going to destroy them because they have been deceptive. He allows them to stay alive, but he does cause Joshua to make these individuals his servants. Now, we get into Joshua chapter 10, and you have there on your notes, and I don't have this other section here copied out for you, but you have there on your notes, the last page, you have some end notes, verses 8, I think number 18 through 23 applies to the section that we read. If you want to look at those later, you can. But this sets the tone for what's going to happen. That is, for this situation with the army and the sun standing still. And what's really interesting to me, and it's kind of, I think, silly in some ways as well, is when you look at very much about the sun standing still, people seem to have a lot of things to say about it, and I think sometimes they overlook the idea that it was a miracle of God. They try to explain how the sun could stand still and how that would affect the universe. Well, if there's one thing we know about God, he does whatever he wants and things work out like they do because he is God, because it's a miracle. He goes beyond nature. But the more and more I studied this and looked at it, the more and more I found those. And even this commentator here talks about the different ideas concerning the sun standing still. But again, it's just a power, showing the power of God. Now, we have found here in Joshua 9, like you have in your notes there, faith endangered, really endangered, because these men, when they fooled Joshua, they no doubt were coming to him with a chance of them figuring out what's going on and killing them all. But God shows his power by showing his mercy to the Hivites. They still were servants, but they still were spared their lives. Now, as we get into Joshua chapter 10, we have, and we're really only going to go through verse 15. We have the occasion where there's an army coming in, and Joshua asked basically for more time to conquer this army. And let's look at just a few verses before we take our break. So I don't want to get into too much of this before we take our break. But in Joshua 10, again, this is just a continuation really of what we just read in chapter 9. But in chapter 10 it says, "Now it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so had done to Ai and her king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them." Now notice first of all how the acts of God are spreading so far that people are learning about them and are being afraid of Joshua and the followers of God. You notice there, it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai. He's hearing about the battles. And it has to be a pretty big battle and pretty outstanding victory for him to take notice of it. You know, just a little skirmish and a victory there, he's not going to take notice of a king. But if someone takes Ai in such a degree that the king takes notice, it shows the power of God through his servants for their victory. You know, God provided the victory in all these things. He says in verse 1, and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king. So he had done to Ai and her king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. They're saying, look, we've seen the battle here, and he destroyed them. We've seen the battle of Jericho, and he destroyed them. And what he did to Jericho and her king, and Ai and her king. And now look, Gibeon has managed to make a treaty with Israel. Verse 2 says that they feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all the men thereof were mighty. And so they're fearing, it seems like when you read this, that they're fearing that they're going to make an allegiance, which they have, and that maybe they're going to come against Jerusalem. And so he is fearing, the Bible says in verse 2, that they feared greatly because of Gibeon. And since Gibeon just made this treaty with Joshua, no doubt they were fearful. You know, when two nations, especially large nations that are powerful, come together, especially if they're nations you think they're going to be a threat to you, you get a little bit nervous. You know, we think about today, when we see a nation getting powerful and start doing things that we're not so sure about, what happens? We start seeing it in the news. Our leaders start getting a little nervous. And that's what's happening here in verses 1 and 2. He's getting a little nervous, saying, look what they did to Ai. Look what they did to Jericho. Now Gibeon has aligned themselves with Israel, and he is greatly afraid. Verse 3, "Wherefore Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, went into Hobon, king of Hebron, and unto Param, king of Jermoth, and unto Jeba, king of Lachish, and unto Debir, king of Eglon." And so he goes to here, what is it, 4 different kings, and Jerusalem being the 5th king. He goes and he goes to 4 different kings of 4 different nations. And the reason for that, of course, goes back to that he's afraid because he's seen what has happened to all these other cities. He sees that Gibeons align themselves with Israel. Verse 4 says, "Come up to me and help me, that we may smite Gibeon, for it had made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel." And so their idea is that they're going to come against Gibeon, because Gibeon has, in their mind, done this treacherous thing by aligning themselves with Israel. Now they're going to come up against Gibeon. Now, let's go ahead and stop there, and let's take about a 10-minute break.